In 1898, James Joyce's home life was full of constant upheaval, chaos, violence and uncertainty. Joyce sought out a new world of friends and was determined to challenge the romantic Irish literary establishment.
I think it's very interesting, his friends at university, because they perfectly encapsulate the two sides of his character. There's J.F. Byrne, who was his intellectual equal, but was also quite high-minded and pure of soul. And then there was the medical student, Cosgrave, who would accompany Joyce to the Monto district and go into the brothels and things.
Joyce shows himself as somebody who has independent and rather more sophisticated literary opinions than his often very crass school contemporaries. And he certainly assumed that persona in the university years.
In 1899, Joyce began writing a series of critical articles on the Irish nationalist romantic movement, but the very first, attacking the Gaelic revival, was banned.
What a blow to Joyce when his first work, intended to be public work, is rejected. He can't believe at this point that anybody would reject anything about him. He's really quite so entitled at that point.
He refused to side unambiguously with the nationalist Republican movement. He was prepared to be critical of it, nor did he give it to the new literary movement under Yeats, which Yeats created the Celtic twilight, and Joyce refers to it laconically in Finnegan's Wake as the cultic toilette.
He had no time at all for the Celtic revival, really. He didn't have any time for that Irish folklore and mythology and mysticism, and he would just say, why don't they just pull themselves together and stop being so sad? I mean, he saw himself as a sort of an Irish comic, a great joker at the universe. So to go around in a sort of melancholic kind of swoon was just not him at all.
Joyce's nonconformist radical views were building him a notorious reputation as an outsider and a dangerous man. Nights of drinking, arguing and whoring in Monto's brothels were taking their toll. He was building up huge debts, making many enemies, and life at home was becoming insufferable due to his father's drunken violence.
He couldn't really study at home, so he spent a lot of his time actually studying in the National Library, which in those days stayed up until 10 in the evening.
Joyce was indignant. His friends, his family and repressive country all were conspiring to thwart his genius and ability to write. He decided it was time to leave Ireland. With encouragement from poet W.B. Yeats, Joyce set off to Paris on a journey that would distance him from Ireland for the rest of his life. He enrolled at Paris's Sorbonne University.
His French wasn't good enough to study at the medical school there, and I just don't think he really had any interest in it. He wanted to be a poet most of all.
Joyce struggled to survive, writing book reviews and studying at the bibliothèque.
He would spend long evenings being very studious and writing poems and reading about Aquinas and Augustine and things. And then later on he'd shoot out into the town and go to the brothel district.
He was soon heavily in debt and had a reputation as an uncontrollable hellraiser. At night, Joyce was seduced by the hallucinogenic world of the artist's favourite drink, absinthe, the Green Fairy. But reports of his notorious and self-obsessed behaviour were shocking his friends back home in Ireland.
Joyce sent 2 postcards back from Paris, one of them to Byrne and one of them to Cosgrave, and the one to Byrne contained a poem. And the one to Cosgrave was boasting about the Paris brothels and the prostitutes, which of course is what horrified Byrne so much.
At home, many friends feared that Joyce the sinner had become uncontrollable. John Byrne deeply disapproved of Joyce's debauchery and predicted Joyce would end up an alcoholic like his father. Joyce's behaviour had lost him his best friend. He also upset his family, pleading poverty and making them pawn their few valuables to send him more money. Paris was becoming a trial for him. The romance of living the life of the poor and struggling writer was tougher than he expected.
It was a real awakening for him to find that, in fact, he couldn't succeed without some struggle. But he was in a struggle with himself at this point, sort of not wanting to be on a learning curve, not thinking he needed to be on a learning curve, and wanting to be that instant, I made it.
On October the 10th, 1903, Joyce received a telegram. The spell of Paris was shattered by the simple note, "Mother dying, come home, father." Joyce felt shocked and guilty that whilst he had been dancing with the demons in Paris, his mother was dying of cancer. He borrowed some money and left for home. The mental trauma and turmoil of what happened when he sat at his mother's deathbed was to be the greatest trial in the life of James Joyce. On April the 11th, 1903, a distraught James Joyce returned from Paris to Dublin. His mother's cancer was reaching its final stages.
She doted on James, but she was also fiercer with him than with the others. She was very religious, and by the time she was dying, Joyce had broken with the Catholic Church. "I will not serve," he said.
His mother pleaded with him from her deathbed to confess his sins, do penance, and receive Holy Communion.
But no, he wouldn't do it. He stuck by his principles as a free thinker. So I think sticking by his principles like that was difficult for him and probably scarred him for the rest of his life.
May Joyce died on the 13th of August 1903, aged 44. James Joyce was now more isolated than ever. He had honed his superiority complex in Paris and arrogantly believed that he was Ireland's national treasure. But he was now dancing with the demons of guilt.
Well, I think Joyce is a classic example of Catholic guilt, and I think without it he might not have written the way he did. You get it right through to Finnegan's Wake, where he talks about his own most intensely doubtful soul. And he did feel threatened by hellfire.
After his mother's death, Joyce drowned his sorrows in the pubs and brothels of Dublin with his old university friends Oliver Gogarty and Vincent Cosgrave.
Joyce had found plenty of sex, but he hadn't found any love. And I think somehow he managed to pluck up the courage to talk to this girl with beautiful red-brown hair that he saw walking down Nassau Street. I don't think he'd ever met a woman quite like Nora before, because the women that he had been introduced to had always made him very shy, and he didn't like their haughty manner. And Nora, certainly, she knew how to call a spade a spade. She was quite earthy, very sexual, and pretty much sort of whisked him off his feet, really.
I think that meeting Nora was the most important day in Joyce's life. That's when he saw his future, he saw his anchor for the future, he saw how she might give the woman's voice in his writing, but he knew he could absolutely trust her.
She was a very simple girl from the country, from a very, difficult family background, and very different to him. He was all head, to be very basic about it. She was all heart, and in some way they connected. I think their relationship was, at least in the early years, a very physical one, and I think that's what bound them together, was the physicality, the sexuality of their relationship. Nora is very loyal to him, really extraordinarily loyal to him. As his father, who didn't approve of her, said, "Barnacle by name, Barnacle by nature, she'll stick to you forever." And that was Joyce's great fortune, I think, that she did stick to him and stick by him, and he cannot have been easy to live with.
June the 16th, 1904 was the start of one of history's most passionate and turbulent relationships.
Joyce did not want an intellectual competitive rival. He wanted a woman with whom he could live out his most base sexual desires, which he did with Nora.
By August 1904, Joyce was staying with his friend Gogarty in an old Martello tower outside Dublin at Sandy Cove. He was struggling to write his portrayal of Dublin City and the life in it.
Joyce was always an outsider. He was always somebody of whom people had a suspicion. They were a little bit afraid. And then, of course, artistically, look what he was doing. He was using real places under the real names. He was starting to put in characters that were known and identifiable in Dublin under the real names. He was writing about pubs, giving their names, and people were a bit shocked by this.
Joyce continued to write critical reviews and would often mock and ridicule his closest friends.
He was quick to take offence and seemed to delight in testing people's loyalties. And most of his friends, especially the male friends, almost all of his male friends, failed that test in the end. And he had to discard them. The Holy Office is a good example of that, where he slags off left, right and centre all the people he feels have betrayed him, Gogarty in particular.
Gogarty was enraged to discover that Joyce had portrayed him as elitist and a snob. Gogarty would have his revenge. In September 1904, Joyce returned to the Martello Tower at Sandy Cove. But also staying that night was a friend of Gogarty's, Samuel Trench, a deeply disturbed man. The extraordinary events that night would become the Tower episode in the opening of Joyce's masterpiece, Ulysses. The three men drank and argued late into the night, but in the early hours, Joyce was woken by Trench screaming after a nightmare.
Now, Trench had a gun, which he kept by him at all times. He woke up in the middle of the night and was raving about a black panther that he'd seen in the nightmare. He took out his revolver and he shot, just above Joyce's head, actually. And Joyce in the dark was terrified, obviously, as you would be, but Trench soon fell asleep again.
But soon afterwards, to Joyce's amazement, Trench woke up again, raving and screaming about the Black Panther attacking him. Then Gogarty woke up, grabbed his gun, and shouted jokingly, "Leave him to me."
And shoots at all the pots and pans above Joyce's head. I mean, that's the clearest sign you can have that you're not really wanted anymore.
Joyce, scared stiff, believing Gogarty might have killed him, ran down the stairs and escaped into the night. 2 days later, Joyce decided to make a clean break.
He knew he wanted to be the greatest writer in the world. He had things he wanted to write. Under the system of censorship, everything that prevailed in Ireland, he couldn't do what he knew he was destined to do, so he got out.
I think it was very important for Joyce to leave Ireland. At the end of a portrait, Stephen says, the shortest way to Tara is via Holyhead. Tara is the centre of ancient Ireland, recognised as such. And what he meant by that was that in order to understand the Irish experience, it's necessary to distance yourself from it. And Joyce did that.
Joyce and Nora decided to elope into exile. First, they went to Paris, but then Joyce was offered a part-time teaching post with the Berlitz English School in Trieste, Italy.
Well, when they arrived in Trieste, Joyce put her in as he had done when they stopped in Paris. What do you do with a young woman? You put her in a public park and let her wait on a bench. So she was just left sitting on a bench.
Joyce made for the main square, looking for a cheap hotel. He soon found a bar and was in trouble.
Some English sailors had got into a brawl and he offered to help interpret for them because he knew Italian very well.
Joyce was arrested for being drunk and disorderly.
Some time passed and Nora was left sitting there, and if any woman has ever sat in a public park in a Latin country will know actually she invited a certain amount of leers and catcalls. But she waited, and one just can only imagine what went through her mind there. She had no way of even getting out of that park.
Meanwhile, the British consul was called and eventually Joyce was released.
She was totally dependent. She did what she did the rest of her life with him. She waited until he got her out of the hole he'd got her into.
Austro-Hungarian Trieste was the ideal environment for Joyce's writing to bloom. Having escaped the paralysis of Dublin, he had discovered a city rich in content to sharpen his pen.
It's a multicultural city, it's a Mediterranean city at the same time, it's an exotic city, it's an oriental city. All you have to think about are the brothels. So many of them here had this oriental kind of ornamentation. That would have fascinated Joyce. So he was open to all of that. You know, he was constantly walking around, taking notes.
Joyce would spend hours in bookshops, bars and cafes, writing and rewriting the novels The Dubliners and Stephen Hero. With little money, he continued living an extravagant lifestyle. Nora was left more and more isolated.
They keep moving apartments. In the early years, they're living in pretty grim apartments. And that constant upheaval, which Joyce seems to have needed, he seems to have written well out of that upheaval. I think his family, those around him, paid a huge price for that. It was tough on Nora to watch Joyce going out and order 30 books. Tough